What if I told you that history's greatest lie wasn't what was written, but what was deliberately erased? For centuries, two versions of history existed side by side, one written in ink by colonizers, the other passed down through generations by those they conquered. Guess which one you were taught to believe? But now, oral histories once dismissed as myths and legends are being unearthed, and they're shattering everything we thought we knew about our past. In Hawaii, Western historians long claimed Polynesians stumbled upon islands by accident, but oral traditions revealed sophisticated celestial navigation systems that predated European methods by centuries. The colonizers weren't the advanced ones, they were playing catch-up. Aboriginal Australians passed down Ice Age memories for 10,000 years with shocking accuracy. Colonial scientists dismissed these stories until geological evidence proved them right in 2015. Why would colonial powers deliberately ignore evidence of complex indigenous knowledge? What were they hiding from the world and from you? Native American oral traditions described a supernova explosion in 1054 CE with precise details. Colonial astronomers dismissed it as myth until telescope technology finally caught up in the 20th century.
Who were the real scientists and who were the real myth makers?
Colonial records claim Columbus discovered America in 1492, but indigenous oral histories from multiple tribes describe European contact long before, details now being confirmed by archaeological evidence. When Viking settlements were finally discovered in North America in 1960, academics were shocked, but local indigenous peoples had been telling stories about pale men with hair on their faces for centuries. Maori oral histories described Antarctica in detail long before European discovery in 1820. Their ancient voyaging traditions spoke of a white land to the south where it was so cold human breath turned to stone. These weren't lucky guesses, these were sophisticated knowledge systems deliberately ignored by colonial powers who needed to portray indigenous peoples as primitive to justify taking their lands. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This wasn't just about history. It was about who deserved to own the land. Aboriginal Australian stories described extinct giant animals with perfect anatomical detail, animals that disappeared 40,000 years ago. How could these primitive people preserve such knowledge without writing? Colonial powers knew the threat these oral histories posed. That's why they forced indigenous children into schools where speaking their languages, the vessels of these histories, was punishable by beatings or worse. What would you do if someone tried to erase your entire people's memory? How far would you go to preserve the truth when speaking it could get you killed? The Maya oral traditions preserved astronomical knowledge so precise it predicted solar eclipses to the minute. Spanish priests burned their books, calling them works of the devil, while stealing their mathematical concepts. The Maya independently invented the mathematical concept of zero centuries before Europeans. Colonial powers took the knowledge while destroying the culture that created it. Inuit oral histories describe coastal landscapes now underwater due to rising sea levels after the Ice Age. Modern sonar mapping confirms these stories with chilling accuracy, down to specific rock formations. West African griots preserved histories of vast empires like Mali and Songhai. Colonial records downplayed or erased these civilizations to portray Africa as a land without history, justifying the slave trade. How do you justify enslaving people you recognize as equals? You can't. First, you have to erase their history, their achievements, their humanity, then rewrite them as savages in need of your civilization. Indigenous medicinal knowledge passed down orally is now being validated by pharmaceutical research. Plants described in oral traditions as treatments for specific diseases contain exactly the compounds modern medicine needs. And guess who's making billions from these primitive superstitions? Colonial records describe North America as untamed wilderness, justifying claims to empty land. Indigenous oral histories describe sophisticated management of forests, prairies, and fisheries for thousands of years. The lie of discovery required erasing those who were already there. The Amazon rainforest, long described by colonizers as pristine wilderness, was actually carefully managed by indigenous peoples for millennia. Satellite imagery now confirms oral histories of vast civilizations. These weren't small settlements, these were advanced civilizations. Pacific Islanders navigated thousands of miles of open ocean without instruments, using knowledge of stars, currents, and wildlife passed down orally. European navigators couldn't replicate these feats even with their advanced technology. Indigenous fire management practices passed down through oral tradition prevented catastrophic wildfires for millennia. Colonial authorities banned these practices as primitive, leading to the devastating megafires we see today. Now, after centuries of dismissing indigenous knowledge, Western scientists are scrambling to learn these oral traditions before the last elders who hold this knowledge are gone. The precision of these oral histories defies colonial assumptions. Stories passed down for 400+ generations still contain accurate details about extinct animals, submerged coastlines, and astronomical events. Maori oral histories about their arrival in New Zealand matched genetic and archaeological evidence perfectly, while colonial records were off by centuries. Who were the real historians?
These aren't just academic debates, they're about justice.
Today, indigenous peoples are using their oral histories as evidence in land rights cases, and winning. Courts are finally recognizing what science already has. These aren't myths, they're meticulous historical records. In 1992, Australia's High Court relied on Aboriginal oral histories to overturn the 200-year-old doctrine of terra nullius, the legal fiction that the continent was empty before European arrival. Canada's Supreme Court ruled that Indigenous oral histories must be given equal weight to written documents in land claims cases, acknowledging the systematic bias in colonial record-keeping. The question isn't whether oral histories are accurate. The question is why we were taught to dismiss them. Colonial powers needed to portray indigenous peoples as primitive to justify conquest. Acknowledging sophisticated indigenous knowledge systems would have undermined the entire colonial project. What changes when we finally hear both sides? Today, indigenous communities are racing to record their elders' knowledge before it's lost forever. These oral traditions survived centuries of attempted erasure, but time is running out. Colonial records described peaceful settlements where indigenous oral histories described massacres. When archaeologists finally investigated, they found mass graves exactly where the oral histories said they would be. Museums worldwide are now scrambling to incorporate indigenous oral histories into their exhibits, acknowledging that their collections have told only half the story and often the less accurate half. In Australia, Aboriginal elders have guided archaeologists to previously unknown ancient sites by following oral histories that describe landscape features altered thousands of years ago by rising sea levels. Indigenous oral histories contain climate records stretching back millennia, knowledge now proving crucial as scientists struggle to understand climate change patterns with only 150 years of written records. What happens when we combine the precision of indigenous oral traditions with the tools of modern science? we get solutions to problems that neither could solve alone. In Hawaii, traditional ecological knowledge preserved through chants and stories is now being used to restore coral reefs degraded by climate change, succeeding where Western conservation methods have failed. Indigenous fire management practices, once criminalized by colonial authorities, are now being adopted by government agencies as the most effective way to prevent catastrophic wildfires and restore ecosystem health. What would your understanding of history be if you'd learned both sides from the beginning? How different would your worldview be if you knew what was deliberately hidden from you? The recognition of oral histories isn't just changing our understanding of the past, it's reshaping legal systems, land ownership, and resource rights that were based on colonial distortions. For Indigenous communities, the validation of their oral histories isn't academic, it's existential. These aren't just stories, they're the legal basis for reclaiming stolen lands and resources. When archaeologists finally investigated sites of alleged massacres described in Indigenous oral histories but absent from colonial records, they found bullet casings, mass graves, and other evidence exactly matching the oral accounts. Pacific navigation techniques preserved through oral tradition allow voyagers to find tiny islands thousands of miles away without instruments, a feat that amazes modern sailors with GPS and satellite technology. Traditional plant knowledge passed down orally contains precise information about chemical properties that modern science is only now confirming, often leading to new medicines that pharmaceutical companies patent without credit. Time and again, places dismissed as mythical in Indigenous oral histories have been found exactly where the stories said they would be, forcing archaeologists to question whose knowledge they've been dismissing. These elders aren't just storytellers, they're the guardians of truth. The next generation faces a critical challenge, preserving oral traditions in a digital world while maintaining the sophisticated memory techniques that kept these histories accurate for millennia. Massive digital archives are now being created to preserve Indigenous oral histories, not just as cultural heritage, but as invaluable scientific and historical data that Western knowledge systems failed to record. The pattern is undeniable. When Indigenous oral histories contradict colonial records, science has repeatedly confirmed the oral histories were right. So why do our textbooks still prioritize colonial accounts? Legal systems built on colonial foundations are being forced to reckon with evidence that the historical record they relied on was deliberately falsified to justify land theft and cultural genocide. Educational systems are slowly changing to recognize that Indigenous knowledge isn't mythology to be studied as cultural curiosity. It's science, history, and medicine that often outperformed colonial alternatives. From fire management to fisheries, water conservation to medicine, Indigenous knowledge preserved through oral tradition is now being recognized as essential to solving environmental crises created by colonial approaches. Which version of history were you taught, and why? This wasn't isolated or accidental. Colonial powers worldwide use the same playbook, publicly dismiss Indigenous knowledge as primitive while privately exploiting it for economic and political gain. Aboriginal astronomers mapped celestial movements with precision that European astronomy couldn't match until the 20th century. Knowledge preserved through songs and stories for over 10,000 years without writing. As courts increasingly accept oral histories as valid evidence, Indigenous communities are reclaiming lands stolen through colonial processes that deliberately ignored their historical presence and management. The violence of colonization was systematically erased from official records while being preserved in Indigenous oral histories, creating two parallel accounts of history, only one of which was taught in schools. Aboriginal water knowledge has saved countless lives in Australia's deserts, including those of colonial explorers who dismissed Indigenous people as primitive while secretly relying on their expertise to survive. Museum collections worldwide are being reinterpreted as Indigenous oral histories reveal the true purpose and significance of artifacts that colonial archaeologists misidentified or misunderstood for centuries. As catastrophic wildfires increase globally, fire agencies are turning to Indigenous knowledge systems they once criminalized, acknowledging that oral traditions preserved more effective management techniques than Western science developed. Pacific navigation traditions allow voyagers to find tiny islands thousands of miles away using only stars, currents, and wildlife patterns. Knowledge preserved orally that modern sailors with advanced technology still struggle to replicate. Climate scientists now recognize that Indigenous oral histories contain irreplaceable data about climate patterns going back thousands of years, information critical to understanding current climate change that exists nowhere else. The future lies not in choosing between knowledge systems, but in combining them. Indigenous youth are leading this integration, preserving oral traditions while using modern tools to apply this knowledge to contemporary challenges. Rock art, dismissed as primitive drawings, has been proven to record precise astronomical observations dated to exact celestial events that occurred thousands of years ago, exactly as described in oral histories. These aren't just academic revelations, they're reshaping who owns land, who controls resources, and whose knowledge is valued in society. The stakes couldn't be higher for Indigenous communities fighting for survival. The monopoly on historical truth is finally breaking down. Indigenous communities are reclaiming their narratives, and the world is beginning to listen to the voices that colonial powers tried so hard to silence. They tried to erase these stories. They failed. The question now is, are you ready to hear the history they didn't want you to know?